Welcome to our female reproductive system lecture. We're going to talk about different organs and structures and tissues found within the female reproductive system, how they relate to each other, and their functions. So let's walk through the two images, the primary images from your textbook, identify some of the major organs, and then we'll walk through them in more detail. So we're going to start with the gonads. In females, those are the ovaries, so one on each side. Here you're looking at a frontal view of, on the frontal plane, at least, of the female reproductive system, and here is that sagittal view. So here is the ovary, and then this tube that connects the ovary with the uterus is known as the uterine tube, also called the fallopian tube, but anatomically, uterine tube is more descriptive, so we're using those terms more often instead of the names after people. So from the uterine tube into the uterus, same thing here, uterine tube into the uterus. And then between the uterus and the vagina is the cervix or the cervical canal, and then out to the vaginal orifice. So let's talk about in detail some more highlighted pieces there. Let's add some words. This gland here might look familiar. It looks very similar to the bulbourethral gland in the male reproductive system. And these two things are homologous, meaning that they originate from the same tissues and then develop slightly different depending if the body develops into a male or a female human. In women, we call this the greater vestibular gland, but it has a similar function in women as it does in men, in that it secretes lubrication that aids with a lubricative mucus that aids with sexual intercourse. And the clitoris is the erectile tissue in women, homologous to the penis. So the same tissue that becomes a penis in men becomes a clitoris in women. And then we also have the hymen, which is at the orifice of the vagina. It's an extension of that mucous membrane. How developed it is varies from one woman to the next. And that usually is broken sometime in a woman's life, either through activities, sports, tampons, or sexual intercourse. Those can all break that hymen. Then the two labia, so the labia minora or minus is singular, would be the labia that is a fold of skin without any hair on it. And then the labia majus is larger, has more fatty deposits behind it, and has hair on it. All right. This view. What we'll be looking at an animation of ovulation soon, but as you can see here, this is if the ovary was kind of cut in half and you could see inside of things that might be going on in there. Inside of here are developing eggs, or we call them follicles. And they're called follicles because at the center is the unfertilized egg, also known as an oocyte. Not pronounced oocyte, but oocyte. And then it has supporting cells around it that help aid in its development. And so the egg and those surrounding supportive cells together are called a follicle. And when the follicle leaves, it's caught by these fimbriae, which are extensions of the uterine tube. And then that egg is going to go past through the uterine tube, and somewhere in here, if it's not fertilized, it dies and starts to dissolve, but its pathway would be through the uterus, through the cervical canal, and through the vagina. And those would all come out when the endometrium lining leaves the body during menstruation. We'll talk more about this connective tissue soon. But here, one thing to notice is the uterus has three layers to it. It has the outer layer, the perimetrium, Remember, like the periosteum, that outer layer is a connective tissue protective layer. This middle layer, my, is muscle. So this is the thickest layer of the uterus, and it is smooth muscle, which aids in the delivering of a child. Really strong muscle contractions are going to allow that child to come out through the cervical canal and vagina. And then the inner lining, the endometrium, which is lined with epithelium tissue, because this is a body cavity lined with epithelium. That's what epithelium does. And beneath that epithelium is a bunch of connective tissue. More on that soon. But let's first start with ovulation. So we're going to watch this animation, and I want you to think about 3 things that occur during follicular development or follicle development, and then subsequent ovulation. So see if you can learn something new or be reminded of something you already know.
Ovulation is a part of the menstrual cycle when the ovary releases a ripe egg, or ovum. Inside the ovary are hundreds of thousands of follicles. Each follicle is a hollow ball of cells with an immature egg in the center.
Right, so that's, just in case if it's not obvious, this would be the follicle. The inside of here, that would be the immature egg, and then it's surrounded by a bunch of cells. And as it's about to talk about, those cells are what produces the estrogen and progesterone, the primary sex hormones for females.
The typical 28-day menstrual cycle begins on the first day of menstrual bleeding. During the first 7 days of the cycle, a few follicles begin to grow at the same time. These maturing follicles secrete estrogen hormone into the bloodstream to prepare the lining of the uterus for pregnancy. Around day 7, all of the follicles stop growing and begin to degenerate, except for one. This dominant follicle continues to grow and nourishes the developing egg inside it. Around day 12, the follicle secretes a large amount of estrogen into the bloodstream. When the estrogen reaches the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland in the brain, the anterior or front part of the pituitary gland releases a huge surge of luteinizing hormone into the bloodstream. Around day 14, luteinizing hormone causes the follicle to undergo a sudden growth spurt. Right before ovulation, the egg detaches from the inside of the follicle. The bulging follicle releases chemicals, causing one of the 2 fallopian tubes to move in closer and surround the follicle. The follicle swells until it bursts open, ejecting the egg and fluid from the follicle into the abdominal cavity. In response, the fimbriae, tiny projections at the end of the fallopian tube, sweep across the ovulation site and pick up the egg. Microscopic cilia on the fimbriae's surface transport the egg to the entrance of the fallopian tube. Inside the walls of the fallopian tube, muscular contractions gently push the egg towards the uterus. After ovulation, the egg lives for 12 to 24 hours, so it must be fertilized by a sperm from the male during this time for a woman to become pregnant. If it's not fertilized, the egg dissolves away and is shed along with the uterine lining during menstruation.
So what'd you learn? Awesome. Yeah, I didn't know that either. For example, I think it's interesting that more than one follicle develops at the beginning of the process that leads to ovulation. So let's look at our questions here. What cells produce estrogen and progesterone? It's the follicular cells that surround the egg. So the egg here is being depicted by this circle with a purple nucleus inside of it. It's not actually purple, but that would be exciting if it was. So these cells that surround the egg or the oocyte or the ovum, depending on which version of which book you're reading, are the ones that are actually producing the estrogen and progesterone. And those hormones are important, as you saw, one, to help promote the development and then ovulation of the egg, ovulation being the release of the egg and its surrounding cells, so the mature follicle into or outside of the ovary. And then once those that egg has been released, then these cells develop a yellow pigment to them, and so they're known as the corpus luteum. Corpus meaning body, luteum meaning yellow. And in the scenario that this egg becomes fertilized and gets implanted into the wall of the uterus and leads to a pregnancy, then these cells stick around and they continue to produce levels of estrogen and progesterone that help to support the development of the fetus and help to support and make sure that the uterine wall is full of nutrients, helps in the development of the placenta for the growing baby. If, however, this egg does not get fertilized, then this corpus luteum degrades, as shown here, and those cells just kind of die off. And then the whole process begins again, beginning with multiple of these small undeveloped follicles developing. So what are these things called? So when they're undeveloped, those are called, or immature, those are called primary follicles, where you have an immature egg in the middle surrounded by some cells. More than one of those will start to develop. One of them becomes dominant and becomes the egg that gets released. In the case of twins or fraternal twins, so twins that are siblings that are born at the same time but are not genetically identical, then you would have more than one primary follicle developing at once. And the thought is, the hypothesis is, I don't know how many women they've actually followed this in to know how true it is from one woman to the next, is that the ovaries trade off from 1 month to the next, which one is going through ovulation. But in the case of fraternal twins, it could be that one ovary is releasing 2 individual eggs. So 2 eggs developed and matured at once, and they're both being released. Or it could be that each ovary is releasing an egg, and then each of those eggs could be fertilized. And so that would be the case of fraternal twins. In the case of genetically identical twins, then this egg would become fertilized, would start to divide, and then during the division process would actually split into 2 separate developing balls of cells that are dividing, and each one of those can then develop into a fetus and then a baby. Okay, what else is on here? The vesicular follicle is the mature egg, and it's all of its surrounding cells. So this whole thing would be the vesicular follicle. As that vesicular follicle continues to develop, it gets this thing called an antrum. And this is fluid that is surrounding the egg. And as this continues to mature, you can see it starting to happen here, that more and more of these cells go through apoptosis. And so the egg and just a few of those follicular cells surrounding it kind of become separated from the rest of these cells, so that when ovulation occurs, it can easily be released. And then these cells, of course, are then what becomes that corpus luteum. These are the cells that are producing progesterone and estrogen that is necessary to help maintain a pregnancy. If the pregnancy does not happen, or at the end of the pregnancy, then that corpus luteum starts to degrade. Okay. And it's the presence of this corpus luteum that also, those hormonal conversations, prevents further ovulation events, which seems like a good idea. Okay. Here is what an ovary would look like underneath a microscope. So what you can see here on the very edge here are a bunch of primary follicles, and then the antrum of the vesicle, and here would be the mature egg. All right. This is not a human This it is a photomicrograph of a mammalian ovary. My guess is it is some species that produces litters, because you would have, the way you get lots of kittens or puppies at once is you have lots of mature vesicles. And here you can see you have many vesicles that have androgens in them that are developing. So some egg trivia. We talked about sperm trivia, so why not some egg trivia? One, meiosis begins when women are developing in their mother's womb. Oh, Erin, what's meiosis? Well, so meiosis, remember, is the process where gametes are produced. So in testes, we call that spermatogenesis. So how sperm are developed, and that process from beginning to end takes 40 to 60 days, right? It took 20, 24 days inside of the testes, another 20 plus days of maturation in the epididymis before those sperm are ready. And that begins at puberty for men, and they're developing and producing new millions of sperm every day. Well, it's a different story for women, in that process of developing new gametes being eggs or sperm, happens when that woman was still in the womb of her mother. So when those ovaries first start to develop, the meiosis process begins of those eggs, and then kind of halts, goes into a sort of hibernation, if you will, until the woman reaches puberty. And at that point, when the ovulation cycle begins, then, as we just discussed, a few of those immature follicles, or those primary follicles, will begin to develop, and then one of them goes through full maturity while the other ones degrade and die. So every 28 days, then a female is producing one mature egg, sometimes more than one in the case of twins, but usually one. This also is connected here to the risk of having a child with Down syndrome increases exponentially as women age. So the longer those cells are in meiosis, the longer those cells are halted in the early stages of meiosis, the harder it is for them to come out of that stage successfully. And Down syndrome is a case of what's called trisomy, so tri being 3. So normally we each have 2 copies of each type of chromosome. So we have 46 chromosomes in all of our cells. You get 23 from the egg and 23 from the sperm. As the eggs are halted in meiosis, they get less and less able to come out of meiosis and divide those chromosomes successly, right? Because if your normal cells have 46 and your gametes have 23, those chromosomes have to be pulled in equally in 2 directions. So in the case of Down syndrome and trisomy, instead of having 46 chromosomes, they would have 47, and they would be inheriting, usually it's 23 from the sperm and 24 from the egg. So there's an extra chromosome there, and that extra chromosome leads to what we recognize as Down syndrome. And as we talked about, an unfertilized egg lives about 12 to 24 hours. So very short lifespan for that egg if it does not get fertilized. And at this point, I wish we were together and I could ask you your questions, but we're not. So let's watch a video on fertilization. And you'll start to see why that sperm count. Remember what a low fertility sperm count is? Less than 20 million sperm per mil. So we're going to start talking about why is that the case?
Fertilization is the epic story of a single sperm facing incredible odds to unite with an egg and form a new human life. It is the story of all of us. During sexual intercourse, about 300 million sperm enter the vagina. Soon afterward, millions of them will either flow out of the vagina or die in its acidic environment. However, many survive because of the protective elements provided in the fluid surrounding them. Next, the sperm must pass through the cervix, an opening into the uterus. Usually, it remains tightly closed, but here the cervix is open for a few days while the woman ovulates. The sperm swim through the cervical mucus, which is thinned to a more watery consistency for easier passage. Once inside the cervix, the sperm continues swimming toward the uterus, though millions will die trying to make it through the mucus. Some sperm remain behind, caught in the folds of the cervix, but they may later continue the journey as a backup to the first group. Inside the uterus, muscular uterine contractions assist the sperm on their journey toward the egg. However, resident cells from the woman's immune system, mistaking the sperm for foreign invaders, destroy thousands more. Next, half the sperm head for the empty fallopian tube, while the other half swim toward the tube containing the unfertilized egg. Now, only a few thousand remain. Inside the fallopian tube, tiny cilia push the egg toward the uterus. To continue, the sperm must surge against this motion to reach the egg. Some sperm get trapped in the cilia and die. During this part of the journey, chemicals in the reproductive tract cause the membranes covering the heads of the sperm to change. As a result, the sperm become hyperactive, swimming harder and faster toward their destination. At long last, the sperm reach the egg. Only a few dozen of the original 300 million sperm remain. The egg is covered with a layer of cells called the corona radiata. The sperm must push through this layer to reach the outer layer of the egg, the zona pellucida. When sperm reach the zona pellucida, they attach to specialized sperm receptors on the surface, which triggers their acrosomes to release digestive enzymes, enabling the sperm to burrow into the layer. Inside the zona pellucida is a narrow, fluid-filled space just outside the egg cell membrane. The first sperm to make contact will fertilize the egg. After a perilous journey and against incredible odds, a single sperm attaches to the egg cell membrane. Within a few minutes, their outer membranes fuse and the egg pulls the sperm inside. This event causes changes in the egg membrane that prevent other sperm from attaching to it. Next, the egg releases chemicals that push other sperm away from the egg and create an impenetrable fertilization membrane. As the reaction spreads outward, the zona pellucida hardens, trapping any sperm unlucky enough to be caught inside.
They'll all die anyway, what does it matter?
Outside the egg, sperm are no longer able to attach to the zona pellucida. Meanwhile, inside the egg, the tightly packed male genetic material spreads out. A new membrane forms around the genetic material, creating the male pronucleus. Inside, the genetic material reforms into 23 chromosomes. The female genetic material, awakened by the fusion of the sperm with the egg, finishes dividing, resulting in the female pronucleus, which also contains 23 chromosomes. As the male and female pronuclei form, spiderweb-like threads, called microtubules, pull them toward each other. The two sets of chromosomes join together, completing the process of fertilization. At this moment, a unique genetic code arises, instantly determining gender, hair color, eye color, and hundreds of other characteristics. This new single cell, the zygote, is the beginning of a new human being. And now the cilia in the fallopian tube gently sweep the zygote toward the uterus, where he or she will implant in the rich uterine lining, growing and maturing for the next 9 months until ready for birth.
So a point of clarification, certainly genetically at that moment, it's determined the physical sex of the child, whether it's two X's or an X and a Y. But we differentiate between physical sex and gender. So gender would be your gender identity of how your brain thinks about your body and who you are in the world. And that is a combination of genetics as well as development that happens in the second half of the pregnancy, which is also influenced by the womb environment, which several factors influence that. So it gets a little more complicated than that. But and the other thing I wondered, I watched that several times, but today while I watched it, I was like, man, I still want that job where you decide what music goes with what video. And like, was that an original score for that piece? Did somebody write that? Okay, we need somebody to write an orchestra about fertilization. I guess that could be a really fun job. Okay. Things to note are that there is a physical break here. This is not a continuous tube between the ovary and the fimbriae, as you saw in ovulation. So the fimbriae actually have to move and catch that egg, and also have that adaptation of the cilia along the epithelium that help to sweep that egg into the uterine tube. Fertilization usually happens here. This is also known as the ampulla of the uterine tube, but as long as you understand it's early on in the uterine tube, I think you'll have a rich and full life. But you might manage that even without that information. But as a human, I think that's good for you to know. Fertilization happens here. Early part of the uterine tube known as the ampulla. And then the cell immediately starts to divide into many cells. Eventually, we spend your early life as a hollow ball of cells known as a blastula or a blastocyst. And you were several cells before you reached this point in the uterus and went through a process known as implantation. And that whole journey takes about a week to go from the point of being fertilized to then moving through the uterine tubes through a combination of contractions and those cilia sweeping the forming embryo into eventually the uterus where it can implant. So ectopic pregnancies and pelvic inflammatory disease. What do those two things have in common? This. So because unlike the male reproductive system, which is a continuous tube from the tubes in the testes to the outer orifice of the urethra, there's this break here in the female reproductive system, which means that it puts women at risk of ectopic pregnancies, meaning that this egg could get fertilized and then instead of going this direction, goes this direction. So it's outside of the reproductive system. And it can implant on the outside of the uterine tube. It can also implant on the outside of the uterus. Both of those are really dangerous, both for the growing embryo and fetus, as well as the woman, because it usually, neither one of those places can properly support the growth of a developing baby. And usually what ends up happening is major hemorrhaging inside of the body of the woman. The growing embryo, fetus, baby dies, and the woman is also at risk of dying from that event. So if that is the case, those pregnancies are usually surgically aborted early on. So an ectopic pregnancy can happen in a variety of places. One, sometimes the egg doesn't leave the tube, it actually is traveling down the tube and implants somewhere inside of the tube, or it can happen outside of the tube where the egg comes around or implants on the outside of the uterine wall. It also leaves women susceptible to pelvic inflammatory disease, meaning that if there is a bacterial infection in the vagina, it can move up through the uterus, up through the uterine tubes, and then out of the reproductive system entirely and into the greater abdominal pelvic cavity. And so there's this potential for a bacterial infection to grow and inflame and infect the entire abdominal pelvic cavity, which can be very serious. So let's talk about some different tissues that are found in the female reproductive system. So one of the primary roles of connective tissue, in addition to wrapping around the outside of the organs, is giving support to the ovaries and uterus. So the ovaries need to be kept in some close proximity at all times to the fimbriae, and then during ovulation events is where it physically contracts and moves over where the ovulation event is happening. But what's keeping those in pretty close proximity with each other all the time are these different ligaments. There are these more cylindrical round ligaments. That includes the suspensory ligament of the ovary, which gives support on the superior side. The round ligament of the uterus, and as well as the ovarian ligament here that connects the ovary to the uterus. And I think this one is hilarious. It is named the broad ligament because it is wide, but of course, sometimes women are called broads, which isn't such a nice term, but it makes for a funny moment in anatomy, which is much more funny when we're actually in class together. Okay. So connective tissue helps keep the ovaries and the uterus in place. However, the most support is from the pelvic floor muscles. So now we're looking at the exterior view of the reproductive system, which also includes the digestive system. So we have a series of muscles here that make up that pelvic floor. And the strength of these is really what gives the support to both the urinary bladder and the uterus. Those muscles, however, get stretched and strained during pregnancy. Just the weight of the extra weight of the child developing inside puts extra weight on the pelvic floor, and then birth itself, of course, can do a lot of stretching and strain and tearing of those muscles and the connective tissues that are helping to hold those muscles in place. So that in the worst case scenario, this can happen. I'll give you a moment. So this is called a prolapsed uterus and vagina, meaning, oops, that should be prolapsed uterus and, well, vagina and bladder is what I meant to write there. So many things to get right. Okay, just trying to give you examples of moving forward through mistakes. Okay. So what you should be seeing is this uterus should be up here and the bladder should be here. But if those pelvic floor muscles fail in extreme conditions, you can have a total prolapse of the uterus and the bladder. As you can imagine, that's very uncomfortable and requires surgery. So treatments. Well, early on, and for preventative measures, Kegel exercises, so that would be a contraction of those pelvic floor muscles. YouTube those, all kinds of Kegel exercises that for both men and women. Strong pelvic floor is also important for men's health. And also reducing constipation. So having, dealing with regular constipation can also weaken the pelvic floor muscles. If the prolapse is moderate, then you might be given a pessary by a doctor, which there are different types of shapes of them, but all of these, the point is to give some extra support to the uterus and the bladder to help them stay in place. Those have to be removed and cleaned on a regular basis. And then if prolapse continues, then surgery might be required to either repair the pelvic floor tissues or sometimes a full hysterectomy, meaning removal of the uterus. All right, so talked a little about connective tissue, the importance of skeletal muscle tissues in helping to keep the uterus and urinary bladder in place. And now let's talk a little bit about epithelium, another tissue. So as you saw in both of those animations, the uterine tube is lined with a combination of ciliated simple columnar epithelium and simple columnar epithelium. So the cilia is helping to sweep the egg or the fertilized embryo into the uterus, and that simple columnar epithelium is producing the mucus. So secreting the mucus that helps to lubricate and helps with the overall health of the uterine tubes. And then the uterus itself is lined with simple columnar epithelium. We'll talk about more of that in a moment. And then we find a transition to stratified squamous epithelium in the vagina, which is a place that can see considerable friction and abrasion through birth and copulation. Okay, so what you're looking at now is a cross-section of the endometrium, which is the inner lining of the uterus. And at the top here, it is layered with a simple columnar epithelium. And then you can see a gland structure here. This is all loose connective tissue that is rich in capillary beds. So the thickness of this is going to change depending on where a woman is in her menstruation cycle. All of this, from this smooth muscle lining up to the top, is what is developed every 28 days in order to help to support a pregnancy. If a pregnancy does not occur, then this detaches and leaves the body. But there are stem tissues left here in these glands that rebuild this every 28 days. Okay. And here would be a microscopic view through a uterus, where this lumen would be the open cavity where the fertilized egg, the embryo, would enter and then implant into the endometrium. Then behind the deep to the endometrium would be the myometrium, which would be the smooth muscle, which is doing the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. And then the perimetrium would be the outer portion, which is connective tissue, which helps protect the uterus. So the other epithelium that is found in the female reproductive system is in the cervix. And so the cervical canal is lined with epithelium. And this epithelium, there are some glands here. And the job of those glands is to produce a thick mucus called the cervical plug by your book. And the job of that cervical plug is to basically reduce the entryway of foreign bacteria and viruses. So it's to help protect the body from infection. When a female is starting to undergo ovulation, then the type of mucus that's being produced by those cervical mucus glands changes. It becomes more alkaline, so more of a pH of 8.5. As you saw in that animation, sperm don't survive so well in an acidic environment. The vagina has a very acidic environment because that helps protect the body from bacterial infections. But in the case when it would be handy to have the sperm survive, the cervical mucus membranes are making a more alkaline mucus that helps the sperm to survive. There's some thoughts that that mucus also provides some food and nutrients for the sperm in their journey. And that mucus also becomes less viscous, meaning it becomes more watery and easier for the sperm to swim through. This epithelium is also important to talk about because it's also the site of cervical cancer. So HPV is short for human papilloma virus, which is spread through sexual intercourse. And there are lots of different types of HPV strains. 2 of them are known to contribute and cause cervical cancer in women, and rarely some cancers in men. It's usually in women. And there's a strain that causes genital warts. Those are 2 different strains. So one strain can cause warts, and then there are 2 other different strains that can cause cancer. By warts, I mean genital warts. So the whole reason why women start going to their gynecologist for regular annual checkups, one of the things that happens there is called a pap smear. And the point of the pap smear is they're doing a small biopsy of this cervical epithelium to see if it is healthy or if it is cancerous. And the nice thing about cervical cancer is that it's really slow growing. And the body usually is able to do a really good job of identifying those cells that have been infected with the virus and killing it, and basically clearing the HPV. But that's not always the case. And then it can lead to a case of cervical cancer. So in that case, there are a few procedures that can be done that involve removing cancerous cells. So here's 2 examples. You're looking at the cervix here. So one of them is cryosurgery, cryo meaning freezing. So there's a tool that's used to freeze those cells. Another one is to remove those cells, and it just depends on how many cells are impacted, and in a consultation with a woman's doctor, decide what procedure would be best for her. But a LEEP is a loop electrosurgical excision procedure. And this one, although it can be really effective in getting rid of the cells, there are some complications with it if you are a woman who still wants to have children or more children, because it's reducing the number of cervical mucus glands. And so you could reduce the amount of cervical mucus that can be made, which could, 1, impact your rate of infections inside of the uterus, and 2, because that mucus plays a role in helping the sperm to do their job, can also contribute to infertility. And the loop procedure can also lead to stenosis, which is the narrowing of the cervical canal, which could also impact the number of sperm that can swim through that canal and make it to their final destination. And if enough tissue is removed there, it can weaken the cervical canal, which normally is not a problem, but if you're trying to carry a child to full term, if you have a thinner cervical canal, then that could lead to issues in keeping the baby inside of the uterus for the full term of the pregnancy. So a few years ago, I don't know, at least a decade or so, there was a vaccine that has been developed called Gardasil that is an HPV vaccine that many of you, I don't know, maybe actually got when you were 10, 11, 12. And it's now recommended to give both to girls and boys before they become sexually active and get exposed to the HPV virus. And it helps protect everyone from genital warts, and it also helps protect women from cervical cancer. Worldwide, stats are that about 450,000 women have cervical cancer every year, and about half of those women will die of cervical cancer. Okay, so that was our discussion about epithelium. Let's talk about smooth muscle. So we saw smooth muscle in the male reproductive system helps to move the sperm through the vas deferens and urethra. In this case, smooth muscle helps to move the fertilized egg or the non-fertilized egg from the fimbriae through the uterine tube to the, thank you, Erin, uterus. And then, of course, large smooth muscle here in the uterus. Those contractions are going to aid with childbirth. And what's incredible about the smooth muscle in the uterus is how much it can grow during a pregnancy, which I think is pretty phenomenal and fabulous and astounding. So the smooth muscle cells actually start to divide, and the uterus grows along with the baby. And this becomes a very strong muscle that allows for contractions during childbirth. And then after childbirth, the hormones change, and part of those hormonal changes allows for apoptosis or programmed cellular death of many of those smooth muscle cells, and then the uterus returns to its pre-pregnancy size. Okay, so let's talk about the external genitalia and glands of the female reproductive system. And we've talked about this one. Do you remember its name? The greater vestibular gland, which is similar to what gland in the males? Quiz yourself. The bulbourethral gland, and it's producing mucus and lubrication. Let's get a different view of that one. This is the duct of that greater vestibular gland, right? So there are glands, let's see, yep, glands on both sides of the vaginal orifice. At the bottom here, you can see those holes would be the ducts between the greater vestibular gland and the outer orifice, where the, that mucus and lubrication can get to the vulva. And then the clitoris. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But this is what we can see, but it's not the full size of the clitoris or the erectile tissue of the female. So let's talk about that. The clitoris is actually shaped like this. So this is the part that we see, but the erectile tissue is actually quite a bit more underneath the skin. So you have the body of the clitoris and then the corpora cavernosa. Where have we heard those words before? The penis, right? So similar to the penis, the clitoris also has erectile tissues called the corpora cavernosa. They're homologous traits, meaning they're developing from the same erectile tissues as the penis. And then additionally, associated with the clitoris and erectile tissues is, are these, the bulb of the vestibule, which would be here, which surrounds both sides of the vagina, and those also fill with blood, have an erection during when females are aroused. What's this purple arrow, Erin? Well, it's fascinating to me that this image is from your textbook and they label everything except for these two dots, but they are drawn in there. So this whole orifice is the urethra. What are these two things? Well, they are ducts from the lesser vestibular gland. Also, this gland is the gland known by many names. It's also known as the paraurethral gland. It's also known as the Skene's gland. It's also known as the G-spot. Here we have urinary bladder. Here we have vagina. Somewhere in here is a gland known as the lesser vestibular gland, the paraurethral gland, or the Skene's gland. This gland has ducts that go to the base of the urethra. How developed this gland is varies widely from one woman to the next, which is why it's partially known as the elusive G-spot, because some women have it, some women don't, some women it's partially developed, some women it's not. But it is homologous, or comes from the same developed material as the, well, it's really close to the urethra. What gland in the males surrounds the urethra? The prostate. Yeah. So this lesser vestibular gland, or the periurethral gland, is similar to the prostate gland. It also, during orgasm, can release fluids. Early in studying and understanding orgasms, people were concerned that women were urinating during their orgasms, but that was not the case. It was not urine that was being released, although it was very close to the urethra, but rather it was fluids from this lesser vestibular gland, which has similar parameters to the prostate in that it's helping the sperm do their job of fertilization. But as I said, it's how well it's developed from one woman to the next totally varies. All right. So the nervous system for women, similar roles in women as men. So parasympathetic nervous system aids with arousal, aids with blood entering the erectile tissues of the clitoris and the greater vestibule. Sympathetic nervous system aids with the muscular contractions that happen during orgasm, as well as ejaculation for the women who ejaculate from their lesser vestibular gland. And finally, mammary glands. So part of the reproductive system for women is that once the baby is born, it is fed milk, because we are mammals and we have mammary glands. As we talked early on in the semester, mammary glands are modified sweat glands, which is always fun to think about. But because they're glands, they are lined with epithelial tissue. And they are also associated with a lot of adipose tissue, that adipose tissue serves as resources to make milk. What's significant about that is similar to what we saw with cervical cancer, and many cancers are from epithelial tissue, because epithelial tissue is dividing so frequently, it's more prone to cancer. So when we talk about breast cancer in women, and breast cancer can also happen in men, it is usually the epithelial tissue ducts that are producing the milk. And there's some really pretty progressive ideas and practices with treating breast cancer. And one of them is the chemotherapy is actually delivered at the nipple through the ducts of the epithelial tissue to help target the cancer, which I think is pretty clever. Okay, so that concludes our content of the female reproductive system. So I thought I would end with a few questions. So, what is the role of cilia in the female reproductive system? A, move sperm toward the egg. B, move bacteria out of the vagina. C, move the egg toward the uterus. Or D, move endothelial lining out of the uterus during menstruation. What do you think? Well, let's see what the right answer is. Dun, 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 C. So the cilia are moving things in one direction. At least that's what they should be doing. So moving the egg toward the uterus. Just remember the animation we saw, the sperm actually have to swim against that current. So A is not correct. B, their cilia is not lining the vagina. The vagina is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. No cilia to be found. So not doing that job. And there are also not cilia in the uterus, and the endothelial lining in the uterus is actually moved out through muscle contractions of the uterus, commonly known as cramps. Okay, what types of cells are most prone to cancer? We just talked about this. Yes, yes. The answer is A, epithelial. And that's because they divide so frequently. Cancer is more common in cells that divide frequently because it's when the cells divide that the DNA, the genetic material can gain a mutation in it that prevents the cell from regulating cellular division in the future. All right, last question. What supports the uterus the most to stay in place? A, the vagina, B, broad ligament, C, pelvic floor muscles, or D, round and suspensory ligaments? Just realized I made the answer twice. Right? C, pelvic floor muscles. Certainly the broad ligament and round and suspensory ligaments play a role, and maybe a little bit from the vagina, but really, really important is the health and strength of the pelvic floor muscles. All right, thanks for watching. And if you've got any questions, you know how to find me. Just like I know how to find the right buttons to make this thing stop recording. Bye.